My name's Raj Patel. Welcome. We are here to talk about... Sorry, I should introduce myself. Raj Patel, I'm a research professor here at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs. And I do work at the moment on what food and agriculture policy might look like under the Green New Deal. So thank you, Jamie and Douglas, for bringing us here to talk about macro and monetary economics. As we heard from the last panel, the macroeconomic policy of the original New Deal emerged as the articulation of more than 15 years of popular protest. I mean, in 1919 in the United States, 4% of the labor force was on strike, over 4 million people. And through the era of the New Deal, the number of strikes went up. And it was in that context of increasing militancy and worker activism that we saw things like the Emergency Banking Act and the Banking Act of 1933 and 35, stock market regulations, and agricultural credit changes. Now, those forces are aligned differently today, and they shape the conditions of possibility and imagination as we think about contemporary macro and monetary economics. And we have here an excellent panel that's going to help us do that. Because time is short, I won't suffer you to read everyone's entire biography, but know that they are very, very clever. But I do want to introduce very briefly a single sort of note that might help propel our discussions along. To my right, I mean, obviously everyone's to my right, but to my right now, Stephen Cohen, whose book, co-authored with Brad DeLong, is called Concrete Economics: The Hamilton Approach to Economic Growth and Policy. And he offered a vision of the Green New Deal avant la lettre. Yeva Nersisyan, who has co-authored a paper on financing the Green New Deal, published by the Livre Institute, which for everyone here today is required reading. David Adler has collaborated with Yanis Varoufakis at the Democracy in Europe movement, and he's the coordinator of its Green New Deal for Europe campaign, which places him at the bleeding edge of the processes we're here to discuss today. Bob Poland has written a number of analyses of the Green New Deal, and he is also founder and president of PAIR, Poland Energy and Retrofits, an Amherst, Massachusetts-based green energy company. If we are we cannot now be accused of falling prey to being pure academics, because at least one of us is actually getting their hands dirty. And talking of getting their hands dirty, we end with Rui Tavares, who, in addition to a number of positions at European and American universities, was between 2009 and 2014 a member of the European Parliament with connections to two committees, one on high finance and another on money laundering. And I'm sure he'll be able to tell us the difference between the two. Now, we are going to speed. We are right now on a trajectory towards fully automated luxury communism, as I'm sure you're all aware. And as part of the Green New Deal and as part of this new era, we need more meaningful work. And so I'm going to outsource the tiresome job of timing things to this machine here. And once our panelists have used up their share of time, 10 minutes each if you would, then it will be your chance in the audience to shame them into silence for consuming more than their fair share. So what I'm going to do is just use this clock to guide our presenters to 10 minutes, after which there'll be a gentle tinkling sound and then jeers of opprobrium from the audience if you go on for too long. And after we've had 50 minutes of erudite and wise timekeeping, we'll harvest lots of questions from the audience so that panelists can really sort of reflect on the many concerns that you're going to bring to this discussion. And with that, thank you very much, and we'll start with Stephen.
Well, thank you. I better talk quickly because he's going to cut me off brutally.
They're going to cut you off.
I'd like to give a title to my little talk, and I think it's in Intelligent Design. Choosing it in honor of where we are. Because I really want to talk about an altogether different notion of macro policy from that expressed in macroeconomics models and texts, now that I sit here on the macro policy. I want to talk about policy to deliberately change the shape of the economy. So I don't know what you call it. It's not a new idea, though, not even in the US. Repeatedly, the US government opened a new economic space and did what ever was needed to enable and encourage entrepreneurs to rush in, innovate, expand it, and over time, reshape the economy. Each time, this design was done pragmatically. The choice of economic space seemed obvious. It was not selected by ideology, whether outright or in the guise of economic theory. And each time, except for the most recent one, which was based on ideology, outfitted as economic theory, which ideology likes to do these days, the results have been quite positive. These deliberate designs have been big. They've not been the economy shaping big, and they've not been the emergent outcomes of innumerable individual choices aimed at achieving other goals. They've not been the unguided results of mindless evolution. They've been intelligent designs. Right at the opening gong, Hamilton, as Michael Lind will tell us, set out to reshape the economy, to promote industry, commerce, banking. The tariff was the key, and it fits several locks. First and foremost, promote industry. Restructure America's comparative advantage, if I may talk a little economics, and so end the mercantilist, colonialist economy of America exporting logs and cotton to England and importing manufacturers and high-end services. Multi-wonderful, the tariff was also the primary source of federal finances and would support massive infrastructure programs and an army to remove the Indians who were blocking the westward expansion. The assumption of the state's debts would create a financial market and give the rich a powerful interest in the survival of the new government, which was no sure thing. Let's fast forward, because we're doing history, it's always detailed, to the mid-19th century, where American government took the lead in creating a vast transcontinental railway. And the railway expansion reshaped the entire economy, opening vast new areas, accelerating the development of supplier industries like steel, and giving birth to unforeseeable entrepreneurial industries, such as Sears Roebuck Calendar, we could call that an early railroad app, or Swift's Meat. And the government didn't tax and spend to do this. It instead gave away land to the railway companies, rather lots. It gave away to the railway companies more land than they had in Britain. There were quite a few checks, too. Government also engaged in social design. It disposed of millions of acres of land in what we would now call the Midwest. It did not auction the land. In what we would, instead, under the Homestead Act, they gave away the land entailing ownership rights precisely to prevent giant land holdings and, of course, the expansion of slavery. The alternative, that is an auction, which might now seem to be the normal and right way to go about disposing of government property, probably the only way economists could now imagine, would likely have resulted in a social structure more like that of Argentina or Brazil. Very large estates and great masses of landless agricultural laborers with all the degree of consequences. This was important social engineering. Skip land-grant universities, but these were the policies that shaped America. They were pragmatic and concrete in conception, and of course they were realized with a lot more than just a little bit of corruption. They created brigades of self-made millionaires. Yes, there was an invisible hand, but the invisible hand was repeatedly lifted at the elbow by government and replaced in a new position, from where it could go on to perform its magic. Let's skip the Republican Assembly, the awful and long history of the damn Supreme Court, and even Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives. Call them a course correction. We're doing quick history here. antitrust regulation to deal with antitrust and regulation to deal with giant companies that were no longer controlled by their markets, but instead controlled them. But no ideological nationalizations. A few safety regulations, eventually a central bank, and the vote to the women. Let's skip past Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal because we've been hearing and we will continue. But apart from saying one thing, FDR was no ideologue. He was the consummate, ultimate pragmatist, radically and even frenetically pragmatic. The only major element that they came with in hand the first day was saving the banks and tight financial regulation, and not nationalization of the busted banks and insurers, and not to mention industrial companies, as it happened after economic and political catastrophes in other countries under centrist, left-wing, and right-wing governments. The New Deal is often said, saved capitalism, reformed it, saved it. And I might opine, saved democracy. The odds were poor then. The bet you just try something, see if it works. If not, try something else. We've been over it. Though the New Deal itself was not ideological, it became the definition of the ideology that was post-World War II America. Post-World War II American liberalism. It became the model of what government could do and should do. Next stop, the long age of Eisenhower, stretching out, let's say, through Nixon. Ike started by telling his fellow Republicans, despite your great success in slipping in Taft-Hartley, we're going to keep the New Deal, period. Ike legitimized big government, regulation, the works. And he promised his economic policy concrete, imageable results. The American dream. Straight out of the best pieces of the recent past. The house, the lawn, the car, the washing machine, braces on the kid. And the huge, technologically supreme military. Huge. Military spending under Ike was about twice as a proportion of GDP what it is today. And out of that military budget came support for technology. The entire revolution, talking about the new extension of the economy, the entire revolution in computing and communications, not just some, not just many, but just about all the inventions that have given birth to the digital economy came out of the federal support, mostly DOD, despite the Silicon Valley in my garage hype. And under this long Ike era, there was no redistribution of income, especially to the top. Productivity grew 2% a year, better than we do. The incomes of the top 10% grew by 2% a year, and so did the median income. And if you do that, people live better, because in those days they were getting things they didn't have, and it had value. It was an economy, you may laugh at the car and the washing machine and the braces, but these were huge, and the TV, these were huge improvements, or taken as huge improvements in life. Freedom from low-cost foreign competition really helped, as did a high tax to keep the lid on. Top tax was 90%, though only a very few paid it. And finance, unlike today, was much smaller, and bankers earned pretty much what they earned in other sectors. Have we tinkled?
We have tinkled.
God, can I run 2 minutes over? All right, beginning in the 1980s and continuing across a generation, the U.S. again redesigned its economy. This time it was done differently. For starters, the U.S. government was not the only government targeting the shape of the U.S. economy. On one side, the East Asian governments pushed their economies onto a manufacturing export development path. On the other, the U.S. government accommodated their push by shifting towards what was supposed to be the higher value industries of the future. Upgrading. It was ideology dressed up as economic theory that told us markets would find and develop the higher value industries of the future. So no concrete sketch of what the future shape of the economy would look like was forthcoming. The invisible hand of economic magic was to pick up and realize what the stealth hand of politics had set in motion. So two teams, one Asian, one American, performed a kind of cosmetic surgery on the U.S. economy, a body sculpting, if you will. The Asian exports was sold as liposuction, fat removal. Indeed, the weight of manufacturing in the economy dropped by 9%. 9% of GDP. That's a big number. I don't like to use numbers like 300 billion. Call that almost 2 Pentagons as a unit. And the Washington team performed the implant, deregulating both high and low finance. Finance increased by 5% of GDP, kind of like another Pentagon. And remember, we now have the FIRE group, finance, insurance, real estate, accounts for about 20% of the entire economy. You need some of that, but not at that scale, because much of it is a zero-sum activity beyond a certain scale, and when all goes well. So America clearly needs another economic redesign, so what do we do? First, if I've said any one thing today, we should aim for the obvious and stay concrete. And what in the world is more in-your-face, crisis emergency obvious than green? So that settles the direction. And New Deal evokes, it's been said here, the scope of the transformation that is required. Because a green transformation must include an economic and social rebalancing, if for no other reason, and there are many other good ones, than that a mass buy-in, that is massive and ongoing political support, will be needed if we are not to fail right in the starting gate. And then find ourselves years later, and in a much worse condition, trying a last-ditch shot at green under something like a totalitarian mobilization. Thank you, and I'm sorry to go over.
Yeva, I believe you've got a PowerPoint for us. Excellent.
So I guess I had to use one of the innovations of this period, right? The PowerPoint, couldn't do without it. All right, so my presentation today is based on a paper that Randy Ray and I wrote, and it's up on the Livre Economics Institute's website. It's 56 pages, so it's on the long side, but there is a policy brief version which will be much shorter, which should be coming out soon, probably later this month or early December. So before I go on and talk about how to pay for the Green New Deal, and the title, by the way, is just a play on John Maynard Keynes's little pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, which he wrote for, during World War II when they were thinking about how to pay for that, particular mobilization that they needed. So before I go on and talk about it, I just want to clarify what we mean by the Green New Deal, because it's different, say, between what people think about the Green New Deal in Europe, and it's different what people mean by that here, right? Because, for example, when people say the Green New Deal for the US, they include things like Medicare for all, something that many European countries already have. So this is not included in the European, or would not be included perhaps in a European version of a New Deal, or universal child care, other things like that that Europeans already enjoy, right? So and this is what we use in our estimate. So we have greening the economy, a Medicare for all, a job guarantee, and then those are the main issues that I'm going to talk about today. All right. So the approach we use is the modern money theory approach, and our paper was an attempt to counter a narrative that was being built up when the Green New Deal sort of burst into the national conversation that it's going to bankrupt us, it's going to cost too much, and everybody was just looking at the financial side of things and costing the Green New Deal by estimating how much each of these programs was going to cost and then adding up the costs. And we said, well, that's not how you would, account for the affordability of such a program. And so we used the modern money theory approach, and the main claim of this theory, which was developed among other people by my co-author over the past 20 years or so, the main claim is that a sovereign government with its non-convertible currency is not financially constrained. So for a government such as the United States government, affordability is not about money, whether we're going to be able to find money. Affordability is about the availability of real resources. Do we have the real resources necessary for a Green New Deal? That's really the question at hand. And so the quote from J. Fack Foster, an institutional economist, is very good at this. Whatever is technologically possible is financially feasible, right? And so that's what we're using in our analysis. So what MMT would say is that the government's budget is a tool to be used to mobilize resources in pursuit of a public purpose. And in this case, that would be the Green New Deal, right? As I mentioned, we're using Keynes's work, and so we said, well, what was the other time when we needed to mobilize resources to an extent such as what would be necessary for a Green New Deal? And of course, that was World War II. So if you go back to World War II and how people thought about planning for the war, both in the US and in the UK, it's clear that they understood that taxing was not the source of finance, that money was not the issue, that trying to get money was not the problem. The problem was how to prevent inflation in an economy where you need to devote a lot of your resources to the war. So, and Keynes actually had a big role in reshaping that conversation with his articles, which then were distilled into this pamphlet. It's very short and it's a very easy read if you want to try. So what Keynes is saying is that the problem is this. We have to devote a certain portion of our resources to the war. So what we need to do is try to determine how much we can produce, including using the unused capacity. How much of it do we need for the war effort? And then that tells us how much is left for civilian consumption. But of course, with the war effort, there is more production, there is more income, so there's more people working, right, because we had full employment. So if all of those incomes were to be spent on this limited pool of goods available for civilian consumption, the result would be inflation. So there would be inflation, and all of these increased incomes, Keynes said, would go as a windfall to the profiteers, so businesses basically, and then businesses would pay some of it in taxes, so they would act as tax collectors for the government, Keynes says, and then some of it would be saved. But the workers would not be better off in real terms, right? Because they are gaining higher nominal incomes, but they're not gaining more goods in real terms. So then Keynes says we need to solve this problem in a way that is more beneficial for workers. So we need to defer their compensation, so sort of put them in funds that cannot be spent until the end of the war, and that way we're actually solving two problems. We're solving the problem of potential inflation during the war by preventing workers from consuming a portion of their income, and then we're also solving the problem of a slump after the war, because people were worried that after the war we were going to, say, go back into the Great Depression, in case of the US at least. So we're solving the problem of the slump because then workers have these incomes that they've earned during the war, which now they can consume, and then that will offset the impact of the withdrawal of the government because the war had ended, right? So that's the method. So that's what we say is the appropriate way for thinking about how to pay for something like a Green New Deal. How much can we produce? how much of it do we devote to the Green New Deal, and that tells us how much is left for current consumption, and therefore we can then use taxes or some kind of voluntary savings or deferred compensation, whatever we choose, but the point is not to finance the spending of the government, the point is to prevent inflation, okay? And actually some of the mainstream economists who've been criticizing MMT, the ones who are more reasonable, they do understand that it's an inflation problem. So Paul Krugman actually wrote an op-ed on Medicare for All, and he basically said if the government were to spend this much money, it would be inflationary, right? He did not say that we have to pay for it, where do we find the taxes? He basically said it's going to be inflationary, even though he still sort of at the end framed it as a revenue issue. All right. So if you look at it from this perspective, then you're not estimating these programs independently and adding up the costs. Instead, you're looking at them as sources of resources and uses of resources, because not all of the Green New Deal projects would be utilizing resources. Some of them would actually be releasing resources. So for example, even if you're trying to green the economy, you are going to stop investing in fossil fuels. And you have all these workers who were working in fossil fuels who can now work for the Green New Deal, for greening the economy, right? So that's an example of a release of real resources, such as workers who can then participate in greening the economy. So the job guarantee, for example, right? And job guarantee and Medicare for All, by the way, are the main financial costs. So if you look at that estimate, 93 trillion, that's how much it's going to cost us, right? That's what a lot of Republicans have been using. The majority of that is Medicare for All and the job guarantee. But what these people fail to acknowledge is that the job guarantee is a source of resources as well as a use of resources, right? Yes, you will have and by the way, a job guarantee has been a centerpiece of modern money theory, right? It's the program that anyone who wants a job should be able to get one. The government acts as an employer of last resort, so it offers a job to anyone who's able and willing to work. That's what the job guarantee is, for those of you who may not know it. But with the job guarantee, yes, you will have workers who will work and will earn income, so they will then use that income and they will spend it on consumption, right? And therefore, they will be using resources. But at the same time, you can use job guarantee workers for your greening projects. And so in real terms, job guarantee is both a cost and a source of resources. It's not just a cost, right? While if you look at it financially, you're just looking at it as a cost rather than also a source of resources. The same is true for Medicare for All. All else equal, Medicare for All is not going to be inflationary, it's going to be deflationary, even if you account for increased utilization from people who did not have health insurance before, because you are going to save on administration and you are also going to save because of cost control. So depending on your assumptions, you can save between 1.58 to 4.5% of GDP annually from going to the Medicare for All. Of course, the US is an outlier in that we spend about 18% of our GDP, while Canada spends 10% of their GDP on healthcare, and of course, European countries sort of stand in between those numbers, but closer to Canada and the US is definitely an outlier there. So even if we bring it down by 3% of GDP, our spending on healthcare, we're still way above the European levels, right? And so we are using a rather, I would say, conservative estimate here. And so we, for the Medicare for All, so saying that it could save us 3.7% of GDP, right? So it would be deflationary to the tune of 3.7% of GDP. So this is our summary table, and I'm going to go over it before I talk about the payroll tax, and I'll bring Keynes back there again. So we're not attached to the numbers, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty around these numbers. These are projections over 10 years, especially when it comes to greening the economy. A lot of things can change between now and 10 years, technological change, costs, and so on. So we look at a few estimates, including one paper from Perry, and we take an average of those, or average of the high-end estimates, actually. And so that comes to about 5% of GDP, as 5% of 2017 GDP. And then the job guarantee, the net impact would be a use of resources to the tune of 1%, even though, if you look at the gross impact, that would be much higher. And then Medicare for All would be a source of resources. And then another source of resources would be to end our spending on wars, which, of course, has been proposed by people such as Bernie Sanders. And so the net cost would be about 1.3% of GDP, right? So the net need for resources, I shouldn't say cost, would be about 1.3% of GDP before any taxes, right? So if you want to know how much you need to increase taxes, you need to do this kind of analysis to see what are the resource demands, and therefore whether you need to actually use taxes to withdraw some of the demand from the economy, right? Or whether you can do something else. And of course, this is much smaller than, I'll take 1 minute, but much smaller than what we had to deal with during World War II, when of course the government had to spend much, much more. Oops, I did that. Sorry. So what we propose is that if you do indeed face inflationary pressures, then you can use what Keynes was talking about in How to Pay for the War, something like deferred compensation. So increase, for example, you could increase payroll taxes today, but not to pay for the Green New Deal, but to reduce consumption today to avoid inflation, and then promise the workers a better pension when they retire. So boost Social Security, increase the payroll tax if you need to, right? Because as I said, there's uncertainty around the estimate. But if you do have inflationary pressures, you can manage them, right, with something like deferred compensation, which is what Keynes was proposing. And it's actually doable with what Bernie Sanders was proposing with his payroll taxes to pay for just the Medicare for All component of his program. So I don't need it, don't worry about it. So I'm just going to conclude by saying something that was said previously and something that Keynes also says in the How to Pay for the War. He's basically saying that we need to use this as an opportunity to snatch from the, and this is a quote for this, to snatch from the exigencies of war positive social improvement. And I think we should make the same case that climate change, right, presents an opportunity to do that, right, to get positive social improvements out of a crisis, which we can try to solve with something like a Green New Deal. All right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is David Adler, and I'm visiting you from Florence, Italy, where I'm based at the European University Institute. And I also work with Yanis, whose face we saw blown up full screen a bit earlier. We've talked a bit today about the history of the New Deal in the United States, and even more about theories of financing the New Deal and how we might go about it. I thought it would be helpful from my perch in Europe to give all of you a sense of what is going on in Brussels and across Europe, because this issue is a very, very live one, just as it is in the United States. Actually, I would argue it's an even more live one in Brussels right now. To put it in a more dramatic framing, there is a war going on over what the Green New Deal is and what it isn't. And I want to give you an overview of how to make sense of that conflict, and hopefully some ideas about to fill up my own arsenal, but what I can take back to the European continent. I don't have great news, so prepare yourselves for an onslaught of bad news. Okay, just by way of introduction, I run this Green New Deal for Europe campaign, which is a pretty broad coalition of think tanks, trade unionists, social movements, and some more politically oriented movements like our own Democracy in Europe movement, DiEM25. And we bring all these different disparate actors together to come to form what we're calling a blueprint for Europe's just transition. Now, the reason why we started this campaign was for the reason why we started this, let me just go straight. So anyway, that's who we are. We put together all of these actors. As you'll know, the Green New Deal is a kind of meme of sorts, and it's traveled in quite a quick way across the Atlantic. So we see Green New Deals in places like Spain and Greece, and my fellow panel members have been part of trying to inform the conversation around New Deal Verde or Nuevo Pacto Verde or whatever it takes its form. And our goal as a campaign is to try to braid those bits of European activism together into a Green New Deal for Europe that can actually target the European institutions where they sit at Brussels and indeed in Frankfurt. Okay, So the premise is going to be familiar to anyone in the room, but it's good to go over for 30 seconds. On the left is a graph many of you will have seen. Europe is getting hotter, a lot hotter, and very, very quickly. The one on the right is a very stunning graph that I find many people haven't seen before, which is net public investment in the Eurozone over the past 10 years or longer, which is 0. Okay, so we understand these as being a kind of doom loop. You've got austerity starving the continent of necessary investments in green and industry and agriculture and infrastructure, whatever, that then prevents the ability for member states and communities to adapt to climate change, which of course means that when you get extreme weather events, those communities have to spend, which breaks the rules around austerity and tightens the grip of the fiscal hawks around the need to be spendthrift. So we're trying to break out of that doom loop, and to do that, we've put together these 10 pillars of the Green New Deal. And the basic idea was, as that meme was traveling across the Atlantic, there was a lot of concern around what kind of Green New Deal, what the hell is this thing? I think you put it very succinctly in your bullet points around what it is. But, I mean, I can tell you, in terms of the linguistics and the policy priorities, sometimes it's full-blown socialism, sometimes it's a bit of carbon taxation. It's very confusing. So we put together this thing in May. You may recall that Europe has just undergone a green wave crashing over Europe. A lot of celebratory praise in the US press about this. And many of those people are like, oh yeah, we're green parties. Obviously we support this Green New Deal. But we are less hopeful about the prospects of some of these green parties with sort of desultory records on economic reform. Okay, so what do we say in these 10 pillars? We say, okay, you know, pill number 2. Press idle resources into public service, basic Keynesian premise. Pillar number 4, guarantee decent jobs. You get it. You know, what is this thing and what isn't it? I bring this up because our worst nightmare has now come true, which is that the new incoming European Commission, which is now being headed by the former German defense minister, a woman by the name of Ursula von der Leyen, a deeply despised woman in most of Europe, but somehow made her way through successive failure upwards to the presidency of the European Commission, who tried to appease many of the elements of this so-called green wave by promoting a European Green Deal. Now, the core argument I want to make today is that this is not just a semantic difference, but something quite integral to what's happening in Europe. In particular, I will argue that what's happening with the European Green Deal is a very careful, very clever excising of the radical content of the Green New Deal, its Keynesian heritage, its radical premise, towards something that's much more status quo friendly, much more Brussels speaky. And it's a very interesting thing. If you go onto Twitter right now, you'll see Timmermans, who's nominally in charge of this Green New Deal portfolio, and he'll say things, he speaks very good English, he'll say things like, we need a transformative Green New Deal. And he's winking, of course, towards American progressives, as well as towards the Labour Party, who form part of his past, part of the European Socialist group to which he is a member. But if you look at what von der Leyen says, she says things like, we need a Green Deal, whatever. I mean, it's not clear what she means. So we're really in dangerous co-optation territory, and I want to walk quickly through what the nature is of our objections, or the claim that I'm making here that it's not just semantics. So I'll do this by quickly running through these 7 essays. I should have prefaced this by apologizing for the speed with which I talk. I'm lucky that most of you are native English speakers, because when I give this in Europe, they tell me to F myself. But so 7 essays. We'll go quickly through them. I'm mindful of time. Okay, the first is the size. So von der Leyen has promised 1.1 trillion over 10 years. Basically, no one thinks that that's a reasonable figure. 110 billion for a continental green transition is just, frankly, nonsense. Okay? So it's hard to take this seriously when we're talking, by a factor of 10, we're off in terms of what Europe needs. We think it needs something much closer to 1 trillion per year. Okay? Now, I think this is actually a much more pernicious thing than just being insufficient in size. You'll recall something called the Younker Plan, now InvestEU, which was this response to the crisis of underinvestment in Europe by the European Commission under Jean-Claude Juncker, okay, where he already promised 1 trillion over 10 years. So we are concerned about greenwashing existing policy just by calling it a sustainable investment package. Okay, 2, scope. If you look at the plan that the Green Deal is, it has all the buzzwords: farm to fork, circular economy, everything you'd want. Again, why? Because Ursula von der Leyen is such an unpopular person that she had to stuff her vision for Europe. I kid you not, this thing's called a union that strives for more. You couldn't find more lukewarm liberal language, but all the buzzwords are there, but the basic architecture of austerity is unchanged. So she recommits to what's called the Stability and Growth Pact. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the nightmare of European economic policy, this constrains the amount that individual member states can commit in their fiscal policies to a ridiculous degree, which would have made sense maybe 10 years ago when we were all afraid of what was happening at the height of the Eurozone crisis. Maybe in 2011 when this conference first came to be, we could be, okay, fine. You're nervous about overspending. You don't trust the Southerners. Okay, whatever. We can even forgive that anxiety or fear. Now, it makes absolutely no sense. I'm surprised we've talked so little today about the explosion of negative yielding debt in the world. But when we're talking about, look at the dramatic decline in EU bond yields. There's simply no excuse anymore for Europe not to be borrowing, especially out of its central institutions, which command a great deal of confidence in markets around the world. No one thinks the ECB is really in danger. Okay, so problems of scope here in terms of what it does and does not change, and whether that we can actually call it a Green New Deal if it's not going to undermine the basic or rip out the basic straitjacket that's preventing Europe from delivering its investments. Okay. The structure of the so-called Green Deal is also deeply problematic. To go back to the Keynesian premise of pressing idle resources into public service. So the basic idea there is you have a public-led massive investment from the government, whether that's finance, how it's financed or how we frame the financing of that is up for debate, but essentially that's the core idea. Now, that is not the idea in the Green Deal. The Green Deal is, to quote the president of the European Investment Bank, charged with delivering the sustainable investment package to nudge private finance toward doing the right thing. So the plan is to actually not invest 1.1 trillion over 10 years even. It's to unlock 1.1 trillion. Now, essentially, this is to socialize the risks of green investment and privatize the gains. So we're not in the Keynesian world here. And this, I'm fine with, well, I'm not fine with public-private partnerships, but we can talk about the role of the private sector. That's not this. That's exclusively relying on this to deliver the so-called Green Deal. And the reason why it's problematic is because it borrows the same framework from the Younker Plan. This is what Daniela Gabor, many of you may be familiar with her work, calls the Wall Street Consensus, which is that same logic of cascading private investments, de-risking investments for private investors, just as a way to bring them on side. We're very far from welcoming the hatred of the financiers. And of course, we know, just to give one example of why this is so pernicious, that is that really the sound? I'll go really quickly through them. It was bad. The Younker Plan was bad, in basically complementing austerity as opposed to removing it. Scale, there's no intention to take this thing beyond Europe's borders or to take account of the historical responsibility that Europe has vis-a-vis its emissions around the world. That's problematic. And they're moving in the opposite direction, militarizing their borders, no language around environmental refugees, etc. Number 5, there's no political strategy here. This is not about actually deepening what the Green Deal is and bringing people on board. The current plan is to throw 15 billion at Viktor Orban to say, and call it a just transition. And as many of you will have seen in the New York Times recent exploration of how Orban abuses the common agricultural policies, we should have very little confidence, and now we have Rui here to talk about kleptocracy in Europe, very little confidence that the strategy here is going to be serious. And I just want to read this one quote from her vision, which illustrates the blandness, the utter painful lack of inspiration in the Green Deal. She wants to have a European climate pact that brings together regions, local communities, civil society, blah. Essentially. It lacks credibility in the same way that it lacks vision. And it gives you you could spend a whole seminar in a literary studies class unpacking, doing a deep read of this, right? The way she talks about the shared obligations from the individual to the largest multinational. So, we're not on the Keynesian terrain here. That, of course, raises the question of substance. We still don't really know what's going to be happening when she unfurls this program in the first 100 days. And then speed. Very simply, not living up to the Paris Accords. She's promised Europe to be the first climate neutral continent, basically decarbonizing by 2050. Again, no one thinks that that's fair. So what we do in our campaign is try to roll out a package that can get us to 2030, if not 2025. we hope you check us out there. I'll leave the presentation there. But essentially, we can talk more during the session or after about how this does or does not relate to various Green New Deals that are being propagated here in the States. But all this amounts to a great deal of skepticism and anxiety around the uses and abuses of the Green New Deal as a framing, and the utter cognitive dissonance of a European legislative framework that is gripped on austerity as being a legitimate policy to govern Europe's economy, whilst trying to steal or repurpose or siphon away some of the energy of the Fridays for Future movement and Extinction Rebellion to say, oh, we're responding to your needs. So it's a bit of a schizophrenic moment in European policymaking, and it's very disappointing, but we're going to use all the resources of the brains and the political capital in this room, and we're going to march to Brussels together, and we're going to demand that they do better. Anyway, thanks very much. Sorry I talked so much.
Thank you, Jamie, for inviting me. It's very good to be here. So I'm actually going to talk about some specifics of macro policy in the United States. And we actually have a reasonably good, in my opinion, a reasonably good starting place for thinking about Green New Deal macro policy for the moment, based on what happened with the Obama stimulus program in 2009. So the Green Investment Program that was part of the Obama stimulus program was quite substantial relative to anything that preceded it. I should just declare an interest. I did play a small role in designing and implementing the program, so I have a soft spot for it, of course. I wrote a paper called Green Recovery in 2008 that then got into the discussion in the design, and then subsequently I was hired by the Energy Department under Obama to help implement the program. First of all, the idea of using green investments as a stimulus program, a counter-cyclical program, short-term macro policy, is obviously not original. People have already mentioned the original New Deal included the Civilian Conservation Corps as one of its components. That said, the program in the 2009 stimulus was targeted at $90 billion, so it was 12% of the overall program, the $800 billion two-year stimulus program. Yes, the program was too small, but nevertheless, within that framework, the role of the green investment features of the overall ARRA, the stimulus program, was quite substantial. It was 12% of the whole program. It was a remarkable conceptual breakthrough, given where debates had been, or not even debates, given where the hegemonic position had been, including in the New York Times and polls and so forth, because the way discussions were going, still are dominated, with respect to climate is, well, okay, we have a trade-off here. You can either save the climate and invest in the environment, or you can go for jobs and growth. Choose one, but you can't do both. I could cite you poll after poll, and I'm not talking about Trump and Trump supporters, of course that's their position, but poll after poll in the New York Times that posed the question that way. There wasn't like, oh, is there an alternative way to think about it? No, we're thinking about massive trade-offs. So the fact that the Obama stimulus program was driven by the idea that investing in the green economy could be also a counter-cyclical and stimulus program and a jobs program was actually quite remarkable, given where mainstream thinking was at that point. Now, the program, there's a lot of issues with it, which I'm going to get to in a second. But at the microeconomic level of actually implementing various features, the program was a success. Let me just give you one obvious example, which was the investments that went to retrofitting buildings to raise the energy efficiency levels of buildings. That is, in my view, the single best way to lower emissions cheaply and quickly in the United States and basically everywhere in the world, which is to raise efficiency standards in buildings. And that was done, and it was done at large scale, and the evidence on job creation panned out. I know for a fact, because I was working on it, and I had done the estimates as to how many jobs we thought could get created, and all those jobs were created. So the program worked very well. The retrofitting program also illustrated a critical component, and we can talk about various issues in financing, but I want to feature one part of the financing package, which is over time, the Green Investment Project pays for itself. It is over time, if we think about the energy efficiency investments, by definition, they're going to lower the costs of consuming energy. And so that all you need to think about is the upfront capital expenditures, and over time, if we're running this building, for example, and you save 30, 40% on energy, and you borrow the money to undertake the initial capital expenditure, well, over whatever, 10 years, you can pay it back through your savings. That is a generalizable concept that will work within the Green New Deal. Okay, so those are the good things. Let me just raise some issues that I think were not sufficiently thought through and which we can improve on as we build a macroeconomics of a Green New Deal. First of all, obviously this program under Obama was created in a crisis, in a rush, and the question as to the proportions of public versus private investment were not thought through seriously, or if they were thought through, the private interests became dominant in determining where the money was going to go. Most of the funding was in the form of private investment incentives. So we say it's a $90 billion program, but the government was not putting up $90 billion. What it was doing was creating incentives to get private businesses to try to invest. And so thanks for mentioning my role as a tiny green capitalist. That's really actually where I started my business idea, because I saw these investment incentives were there and they weren't getting picked up. Now, of course they weren't getting picked up. You're in the middle of the Great Recession. And so, to tell people, okay, there are generous incentives there, but in the middle of a recession, it's not the kind of thing that a lot of people are going to take big risks to move into a new area of business activity. And predictably, though we did get success at the micro level, at the macro level, you did not get adequate take-up rates. And so that really what you need, certainly in the first phase of this kind of macro stimulus program, you need to lead with public investment, not private investment. The time dimension with respect to the investment activity was also not thought through clearly. If you remember, Obama spoke very often about we're going after, quote, shovel-ready projects. Shovel-ready projects, that was the mantra. There's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. There was no such thing as a shovel-ready project. In fact, I just had a student finish her dissertation whose conclusion was there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. And it's a very good dissertation. Thomas knows the student, Thomas Herndon, another former student of mine, knows the student who wrote it very well. Anyway, so if there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project, then, well, let's deal seriously with the time dimension. Okay, the day after President Warren announces the program, how long is it going to take to actually get activity going? And, it depends on the type of project. A retrofit project is not shovel-ready. It's not going to happen next week, but maybe in 3 or 4 months you can get something rolling. Building, putting solar panels on big rooftops is going to take a little longer. Doing manufacturing in clean energy areas is going to take longer still. So we have to understand those if we're going to use this as a short-term stimulus macro policy as well as a long-term growth policy. In terms of the private incentives, the private incentives, as I said, were very important. They were the critical feature, and the public investment component, the direct public investment, like, okay, money to to retrofit this building as a public building was inadequate. That said, the private investment incentives actually yielded some significant successes on which I think we can build. And I will want to cite one case in particular. Some of you may remember, the scandal around this solar energy manufacturing company, Solyndra. The Solyndra company, which got a loan guarantee, $500 million, and then failed. And then, yes, the government was on the hook for the $500 million that Solyndra had borrowed in order to start its manufacturing operations. What the whole hubbub about the Solyndra case did not reveal, though, was that Solyndra was part of a broader loan guarantee program called Clean Energy 1705 Loan Guarantee Program, through which the government didn't just guarantee Solyndra, they guaranteed 24 projects for $14 billion. Now, of the 24 projects, 22 are still in operation. So this was a massive success. This was not a failure. Solyndra and one other company failed. Over time, the net cost to the government through guaranteeing those loans was $300 million. So $300 million helped incentivize $14 billion in clean energy investments, which is a leverage ratio of 50 to 1. Okay, $1 of government expenditure to underwrite these loan guarantees led to 50 billion in private investment. Now, we can argue, okay, and it's no doubt true that some significant percentage of those investments may have taken place even without the loan guarantee. We don't know what that percentage is. But even if we knock off half of what I'm saying is the explicit leverage ratio, 25 to 1, that's still good. 10 to 1, that's still good. So we have the opportunity through public-private partnerships, if you said you weren't too down on them, as one tool to recognize the opportunities there that can emerge through using these kinds of programs. Now, again, the loan guarantee program was pretty good, and you got $14 billion of investments, but we were supposed to get $90 billion in total activity over the 2 years, and then it didn't actually pan out. And so by the time the Republicans took the Congress in 2010, by 2011, basically most of the features of the green part of the stimulus program were taken away. Okay, so my overall point is the Green New Deal as macro policy is viable. We know it's viable. We just did it. We can do it a lot better, but let's learn from what we just did 10 years ago. It works as a short-term stimulus policy, and it can work as a long-term macro policy. We need to be sharper about various things, and maybe the kinds of things that graduate students might want to work on. We need to understand the time lag features of the stimulus program. We need to understand we can't say things are shovel-ready, but really, do we know how long they will take? And then you can sequence out the various investment activities. We need to understand the public-private mix better, and yes, we need to understand the financing structures better. But within thinking about financing structures, the overarching idea is this is a self-financed project over time, and that we really just need to get over the initial hump of investing, doing the initial capital expenditures. As I said, that's a straightforward proposition when we think about energy efficiency investments. It's also true with renewable energy, because if you look at the costs of delivering renewable energy now, and I can refer you to this left-wing publication called the U.S. Department of Energy under President Trump, they put out every year estimates on the levelized costs of generating electricity from alternative energy sources. Solar and wind are at total cost parity with fossil fuel to produce electricity, much cheaper than nuclear. So that will pay for itself over time. We're at cost parity with renewables. Energy efficiency is cheaper. And so we really just need to structure the financing to move this project forward. Thanks.
I'm a historian. I dabble in politics. I know a little bit about European law, EU law. I'm emphatically not an economist. So I'm in a panel about macro and financial aspects of the Green New Deal. I'm going to say something about the project in which we actually worked together and also with Yanis a couple of years ago, called the Ulysses Project, that is going to be reborn as we speak for the next year and especially for 2021. And I want to start with a story. My first encounter with the New Deal was in the poor neighborhood in Lisbon, Portugal, where I grew up. In my early teens, so this is the 80s, there was we used to play soccer in the street, and there was an old lady in the street that lived in a basement, so her windows were like this at the ground level, and of course our football would hit her windows all the time. She hated us. We thought that she was a very, very boring old lady, and one day she crosses me in the street and she asks me, the baker tells me that you speak English. Is that correct? Yes, I do a little bit. So I need you to come over to my house and read some letters that I've received. Turns out that she had been an immigrant here in the United States for decades, spoke very, very few words of English, which it's quite possible she had lived in Newark, which at the time was practically a Portuguese colony. One of my uncles, also a baker, lived there and didn't learn any English. But there were two words that she knew in English, which was Social Security. So she was not the Hoover Dam or the federal highways, but she was a living monument. She was a daughter of the New Deal. So when I see kids in the Fridays for the Future or the climate strikes, what I think is that if we get this right, they will be able to say in 30 or 50 years' time that they are sons and daughters of the Green New Deal, and that we have achieved the ultimate object of political desire, which is to save the planet, have a nice life in the planet, have biodiversity, and have a sustainable human life in the planet. So in a sense, maybe I fit in this panel because what I want to talk is about what postmodernists, derisively called meta-narratives. Meta-narratives, the big stories the grand stories that we tell about ourselves are decisive in politics. So if Yeva is correct, or the author that Yeva quoted, that whatever is technologically possible is financially feasible, what I think is missing from that picture is that you need to politically unlock it. And you unlock it politically with stories, with narratives, where we are, where do we come from, where do we go. Say whatever you want, but Make America Great Again is a slogan that gives you a story. It gives you this space scale. It's about America. It's not about the world. And gives you the time scale. It's about the past. It's about going back to the time where we were great. It's not about the future. Our counter-narrative needs to be exactly the opposite. It needs to be about the whole world and about the future. So the Ulysses Project was also kind of a narrative. It emerged during the Eurozone crisis. Maybe you remember that in 2009, 2010, countries such as my own and others were called the pigs of the Eurozone. It was Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and the acronym was PIGS. Of course, the acronym was dehumanizing for these countries. It's helped explain why, after 2010, Germans and the Dutch and Finns were not receptive to helping out these countries with cash, because they were pigs. They were lazy. They spent their cash on women and wine, as a former Dutch finance minister and Eurogroup president once said. And turns out there's an episode in the Odyssey where Ulysses' sailors are transformed into pigs, not by a financial crisis, but by a sorceress called Circe. And Ulysses has to turn them back into has to give them back their human form. He gives them back their human form by re-giving them their memory. They had lost their memory. And memory is what makes us human, is what makes us, memory is at the basis of dialogue, of political imagination, and of human agency. So without memory, we are not fully human. So the Ulysses Project was about redignifying the role of these big countries in the Eurozone. And to redignify this role, their role is not just to, borrow them cash. Even though I felt it was perfectly possible, you could have, as Yanis and James and other friends were saying in the modest proposal, you can raise federal cash, as it were, from the EU, from the European Central Bank, and give it directly to the countries afflicted by their budgetary crisis. But the crisis of Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, set aside Ireland here a little bit, although Ireland is also a Ulysses country because of James Joyce and Ulysses the novel. Ulysses proper was not in Ireland, although he was in Portugal, he founded Lisbon, but it's also a Ulysses country. The problem of these countries is more a problem where do they fit in the economy of the Eurozone? What are they good for? You need to know that in order for you to know that you are worthy of esteem, of self-esteem. So the problem of these countries was mostly a problem of having an economy that was based in low wages, not much complexity in the products that they produce, so low added value. So it's more of an economic structure problem than a budgetary problem. Borrowing them money was, I defended that policy, was important to address budgetary issues, but the problem is that these countries have economic structures that do not make them fit for purpose in the economy of the Eurozone as a whole, and that create a hard job for these countries to find their role in globalization. And it's turning for the worse because, of course, Portugal, for instance, it's these three graphs. Portugal is getting older. Lots of people are leaving the country, especially the youth and the highly educated youth. And we are having less people now. And you can see that also in other European countries. So here you have the map of brain drain in Europe. So there's a clear regional aspect to this. The south and the east migrate. Central Europe, and at the time this is pre-Brexit, the UK received these people, mostly highly educated youth. This map is the map of the most innovative regions in Europe in terms of the economy of innovation, and it's basically more or less the same map. The youth are migrating to where you have more economic innovation. So what do you need? You need to have an agency at the European Union level that focuses on regional aspects of the crisis in Europe, so asymmetrical aspects of the crisis in Europe, and decides, for instance, to build brick and mortar federal universities in Southern Europe, where you have cities where everybody would like to live during their degrees, Lisbon, Naples, Athens, and maybe stay there afterwards and renew the economy of these countries, but you need to have money in order to do that, or you need to have political packages in order to do that. This is a map of seismic risk in Europe. Also, something that you can do. You spend lots of money if you rebuild after an earthquake. You have earthquakes in Greece, in Italy. The little spots that you see there in the west is, of course, my hometown, Lisbon, that was destroyed by a famous earthquake in 1755. If you spend before the earthquake, you actually spare money because pre-earthquake spending is less, you refit infrastructure, and for each euro that you spend, you are going to spare 7 euros, because also if you spend after the earthquake, the money is very quickly dissipated through corruption, mafia, grabbing the money. I was in the European Parliament when the L'Aquila earthquake in Italy happened. After the earthquake, everybody is shocked, so there was lots of money being disbursed to L'Aquila, but it just so happens that the buildings that have been the most affected were the buildings that had been rebuilt after the last earthquake of L'Aquila 30 years before, where the money had been spent in exactly the same way. And, you know, the mafia-linked contractors were using that money to build infrastructure that was not fit for purpose. This is forest fires in Europe. Also, very clearly, it's an asymmetrical problem in Europe. But then you have probably asymmetrical solutions for Europe as well. This is solar, you know, the map of solar power in Europe. So you could very easily have a big project of solar power distribution in Europe where the south exports solar power to the north. And now in Europe, you usually, people not only ask you, here in the United States, I get the sense that the question is mostly, where does the money come from? In the EU, the question is usually, do you have a legal basis for that? And the reason is because the EU does not have what German constitutionalists call competence, meaning that the EU does not attribute itself new competencies. The EU derives its competencies from the member states that, you know, approve new treaties, ratify new treaties, and only then does the European Union have the competence to act in one or another aspect of a crisis that they have to face. This was a problem during the Eurozone crisis. There was a big discussion about, does the EU have a competence to bail out southern countries? And northern countries would say, no, 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 this goes against the treaties. Big, you know, legal question, also about what Mario Draghi could do or not do. There were challenges in the European Court of Justice against quantitative easing by the European Central Bank. But it turns out that fighting climate change is already in the treaties. And actually, it was used during the crisis of the Eurozone. You may remember that the first Greek bailout had as a legal basis not this article, Article 107 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, that says there, this is about state aid. You know that in Europe, member states are not allowed to directly finance industries, for instance, unless this funding occurs as part of a number of exceptions where then member states can fund, directly fund industries. This is one of the big debates in British Labour because, yeah, I have to finish. You know, Corbynites usually say that they cannot nationalize, that they cannot give state aid to British industries, but actually they can. It's a question of law. But here, point B, you know, you can give aid to make good the damage caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences. And if Germans complain, it's actually the same article that says in point C that Germany can spend, you know, state aid reintegrating Eastern Germany into Germany. So it is the exact same article that they've used. And in Article 122 that was used for the Greek bailout, you also have where a member state is in difficulties or is seriously threatened with severe difficulties caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences beyond its control, the Council here, the EU can directly fund the member state. It's one exception where you can directly fund a member state. So climate crisis is actually, you have a legal basis to fight climate change. Well, of course, there's a history. It's the history of the Tennessee Valley Authority as an energy-based project during the Great Depression to help a region of the United States not only become self-reliant, but also export energy for the rest of the US. The quote is from the dialogue between Senator Norris and Roosevelt about what is the political philosophy behind the Tennessee Valley Authority, and Roosevelt answers, I'll tell them it's neither fish nor fowl, but whatever it is, it will taste awfully good to the people of the Tennessee Valley. So, you know, new pragmatism, as Gregor was saying. The US taxpayer, as far as I know, does not spend money in the Tennessee Valley Authority today. On the contrary, the TVA exports energy and makes money. And I'll conclude with just this. Maybe we have to think about the New Deal as something larger than just what happened in the 30s here in the United States. The New Deal is actually the second deal of modernity, being the first was absolutism in the 18th century. It unraveled with the Lisbon earthquake, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Then you have this New Deal, and that deal was a deal between subject, God, and king. The New Deal is a deal between people, nation, and state. You know, Social Security. We'll have $1 from the worker, $1 from the boss, and we'll create this box where if you are unemployed or if you're ill, you can collect that money back for you to use. It's the national government solving stuff. Now, for the climate crisis, and this goes back to what I said in the beginning, we have to, in the left, in the progressive side, we have to admit that there is indeed a problem of sovereignty mismatch. The problem is transnational in scale and in substance. It's structurally a post-national, a transnational problem. We are not going to solve it by just creating national institutions or national policy packages or even intergovernmental things like the Paris Agreement. What we have to think about is how to create cosmopolitan institutions that will help transfer the sovereignty of the individual, the agency of the individual, the transnational movements that we are creating in order to solve these problems. It's a little bit like, the fireside chats were still thinking about how to solve problems with stories, with narratives, with meta-narratives, in order to unlock the political potential of a nation and solve the Great Depression. But in the For Freedom speech, Roosevelt is already thinking about the international level. It's about freedom from fear, from want, everywhere in the world. He always adds after those sentences, everywhere in the world. It's about a global problem. We have now a heated political topic about controversy about nationalism and cosmopolitanism. I think that sometimes I see a temptation in the left for us to use the old tools of nationalism in order to solve these problems, not realizing that when we are doing so, we are actually strengthening the kind of political scale that will then be used by the far right and the right wing for their reactionary purposes. So we do indeed have to overcome the fear of assuming our cosmopolitanism, which sometimes is not politically easy in our current context, but people, especially the youngers than us, they will understand that you only solve this problem through a cosmopolitan attitude. And that, I think, it's still lacking in our debate of New Deals, even if at the European, which is a transnational level. Thank you.
And thank you, panel, for guiding us to now a very attenuated, but it's going to be lively 10 minutes of questions. Please can you raise your hand if you have a question, and please use your time as you would carbon. And just think about your question in the way that Greta Thunberg thinks about flying. And so keep it short and keep it, if you have to do it at all. But if you do, you have to.
Okay, Raj. My question is about the quote that you mentioned, whatever is technologically possible is financially feasible. But the projects in the Green New Deal really have to do with a different type of resource, which is a care resource. And so I'm wondering how you figure revaluing or reimagining the value of labor that has to do with care, teaching, childcare, all of this, healthcare, revaluing that work in an economic model for the Green New Deal.
This question's for Bob Poland. Bob, in the earlier panel, there was a lot of people talking about the labor movement, and I am aware of that there was a lot of criticism in the construction labor movement of the retrofit programs. And particularly that the jobs created were not as they saw them good jobs. I think that's an enormously important issue, and I wonder just your reflections on it, because I'm sure that you personally tried your best in that space, and I think it's just absolutely critical linking this panel to the last one.
We have another, perhaps the last question over there. And while Lovely is moving the microphone over, I'm curious because this entire panel has shown that we can, in theory and in practice, and even in law, undertake some of the work of the Green New Deal, but we can't seem to, we're lacking that cosmopolitan politics, we're lacking the narrative. And we're up against the way that finance is structured at the moment, particularly finance, insurance, and real estate. How do y'all imagine that transformation, or how do y'all narrate the story of how it is that we get from here through those obstacles, particularly the obstacles of finance and of this right-wing politics that's very much articulated to this world of the Green New Deal? And I'll leave the last question to the gentleman there.
Sure. Thank you all so much for all your contributions to improving life on Earth for all of us. And along the similar question to Raj is more of matter of looking around the room, there's just a lot of academics and policy people, but very few ordinary people, working people. And so how can we get some of the messages that you all are researching to larger audiences? Of course, social media is one platform, and various candidates are trying to really galvanize people via that platform. But I'm really curious for some of you to just talk more very realistically, how can we take these ideas to the masses and to really kind of create the transformation that we all kind of realize we need, but in practice, I know a lot of poor people who don't know anything about what we're talking about, and but when they hear about having a good job and have healthcare, they like that. So just how to translate some of this into ordinary language, I guess, for people.
Thank you. And we can just go down the line with final remarks from.
Well, they were aimed questions.
But some of these, I mean, I don't know, Ian, if you want to take on how it is that fire might.
Well, the fire is, let's call it 20% of the economy in the fire business. Used to be less than half of that, and it worked fine. Finance worked great 30 years ago. It certainly doesn't perform better, whatever measure you want, because nobody's got an output measure. It's flab at best, and you wonder why people feel they're not getting anything in this economy. Well, first, from there's nothing much to get. So you take a good, I'd say, dozen% of your economy and say, this provides no value to people. It's price without value. Then you can have your own opinion on the other, let's call it 5 that goes to the Pentagon, and you're beginning to get some things. So that seems like a place for reduction, enormous reduction. That said, what I hear in this room is a much greater concern with, let's say, the New Deal aspect, and a acceptance, maybe simply taking it as a starting point of the green aspect. And I really feel, I quite agree with the importance of all these New Deal concerns. As I said earlier, in part to enable the green, but also by themselves. However, I think the real problem we face is the analogy with the war economy. We don't have the mobilization. The war economy has a mobilization, massive. So you are taxing, giving them ration tickets. You're constraining consumption. You can use all kinds of devices. Jamie will tell you about rationing and allocation. But you had the mobilization in order to do that. And I don't think the problem was the war is now. This damn thing, which is the total war, the total wipeout, tomorrow will be okay. There's not going to be any big difference tomorrow or even the next day. So you've got, and a lot of people find it much easier not to contemplate something truly horrific, because anyone with any sense has learned to reject these end-of-the-world stories. However convincing they may be on the first hearing, it's not right. Never has been. So the problem becomes there, and then the mobilization permits the rest. So that's if we're having a Green New Deal. If we're having a New Deal, which is a perfectly good thing to have, we can use it. maybe it can push the mobilization a bit. I don't know.
Do you see?
Well, in the paper that I mentioned, we argue that we need to treat climate change as the moral equivalent of a war. How successful we are in building the narrative in that way, that this is what it really is, that's that's up for debate. But I want to just address the question of care and how we revalue it. And so the job guarantee that we propose and that modern money theory has been proposing for a long time has a major care work component to it. So the Livre Institute, for example, had a job guarantee proposal that they evaluated, the economic impacts of, and that was a $15 an hour benefits, healthcare, childcare benefits, so the workers would get all of those benefits in the job guarantee workers, and a lot of that was care work. So we are basically dividing our job guarantee pool, and we're saying half of it will be for greening the economy, the other half would be care work, right? And then they would be paid this $15 an hour or whatever the living wage needs to be, because for some places that's not a living wage, right? For some of the urban areas, and so that's I guess I would say if you pay them more, that's one way to revalue care work, right? And because it's been traditionally done by women, that's one of the reasons why it has not been valued, and so there's definitely a way to go there. And that's related to the question of quality of jobs, right? That you need to make sure that the jobs you create are of good quality, and so if you have a Medicare for all and then you provide childcare and other kinds of benefits, then I guess that is improving quality of jobs. So that's why you have all these issues, but you need to try to solve them with a big integrated package because they are related, right? They are related issues. The question of finance is actually an interesting one, and it dovetails with what I was saying here, in that if you're trying to find sources of resources, so industries that you can try to shrink, which will release resources for a Green New Deal, well, finance is a very good candidate for that, right? So, and that will be helping with the narrative in that finance is not very popular, so you could say, well, how do we pay for it? We shrink the financial sector, and that's how we pay for a Green New Deal, and I think that would go a long way. But I just want to say that overall, I think it would help the narrative very much if we can decouple taxes from spending, and probably Bob would disagree with me on this one, right? That we need to structure the finance. I think that's usually the argument, but we need to decouple taxing and spending, right? Because every program that has to go through Congress, how do you pay for it? Like the pay for it becomes an important issue, except that only the progressive policies are subject to that test. It seems like the other things like spending for the military or tax cuts, those things are not subject to the same kind of logic. So we need to move away from this pay-for mentality. I would say modern money theory, so the question of how do you take it to larger audiences, has a very big following, sort of grassroots following, I would say, and they've done a very good job of trying to take the message to the average American.
Thank you.
And I would say that has helped. When I was in graduate school in 2006, 2007, the job guarantee, I never thought that I would see that, sort of thrown into the national discourse, and here it is. It's there. So.
Thank you, Yeva. In the minute we have left, David, Bob, and Rui, do you feel like pitching in or?
Yeah, I'm excited to dig more in the course of the day and tomorrow morning about the politics of this. The one comment I would want to make is that, it's been interesting to look at the party systems. On the one hand, the United States is it's a kind of a traumatizing party system in the sense that one of these two parties is a climate-denying party. But on the other hand, that's actually a hidden blessing, because what's happening is that it's forcing the Democratic Party to put together a coalition inside of its party of people who are concerned about the New Deal aspects, people who are concerned about the green aspects. What's happening in Europe, to go back to the premise in my presentation, is that there's a neat split that falls along the nice sort of demographic split between younger millennials who are marching in Fridays for Future, who care about climate, and the people who care about the lack of investment in jobs, namely working communities, frontline communities who care about the economic side, the New Deal side. And what's happening now is this very dangerous thing that's happening because green parties who represent that urban cosmopolitan precariat care much more about the green side, and the classic far right and far left factions are more concerned about taking care of an urban, more rural, wider proletariat. And it's precisely up to us to marry, especially in Europe, to marry those two sides, to insist that you cannot have a green transition that's not also linked to social justice. We talked about in the last panel. And so, to plug my report, we'll be coming out with the next edition of this Blueprint for Europe's Just Transition with what we call pathways to a Green New Deal for Europe, about actually how you make these policies come off the page and into the streets. I don't want to sell it short. I mean, you talked about a mobilization, is the last thing I'll say. 7 million young people on the streets of Europe marching in the name of addressing the climate crisis. That's something closer to a mobilization than we might, I mean.
We've had some nice shows, yes.
Nice shows, yeah, so definitely some nice shows.
That in the States too.
Right, yeah.
But
I agree, it's not a war mobilization. But, you know, maybe, yeah, I don't disagree. But there's something to build on there. And the question is, how do we create the coalition between those youngsters who are interested in decarbonization with people who are serious about delivering good jobs for poor people?
In my remaining 12 seconds, I'll just respond quickly. There's a lot we could talk about on some of these other issues, but very well taken point, Damon, on the retrofit program, which gets to what I was talking about in that the retrofit program was the most successful because it was the easiest to do. It was the closest thing to something like shovel-ready. And then by 2 years later, the program was over, and we were waiting for the private investments to do the construction and manufacturing. It ended up, like waiting for Godot. It didn't happen. So the good jobs didn't come along as fast as the low-paying entry-level retrofitting jobs. The general problem, and I've studied this in a bunch of papers and so forth, if we want to take a broad average, yeah, the fossil fuel jobs on average are paying, $90,000, $100,000 a year. These are good jobs, and that's why people want to keep them. If you take on average the kind of jobs that will get created through green investments, we're looking at 20, 30% less on average, and that's a reality. Now, those jobs are pretty good for people that don't have jobs, but they're not going to be comparable on average to the pay that people now get in the fossil fuel industry, and that therefore that's even further argument as to why the just transition for people in fossil fuels and their communities to be an absolutely central feature of the overall project.
I'm going to use the same 12 seconds and add a little bit because English is not my mother tongue. Well, I think that we need the imagination of the war without the war itself. That goes without saying. So maybe we need to think beyond the war. Maybe we need to think about other revolutionary historic eras, such as the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, that actually coincide also with periods of great technological and communicational change, like the printing press, the invention of the printing press, or mass media, newspapers, gazettes, and books, which correlates, I think, more with our own period. I think that Europe is actually, I share David's, pessimistic view of the Brussels circle. But Europe is actually a very interesting, one could argue that Europe is a place where this can get solved or start to get solved because it is already a transnational polity. Europe is not the United Nations, it's not just purely the EU is not an international organization, but it's also not a country. But in many ways, the EU is more integrated than many countries. Economically, maybe more integrated than Brazil or India. Culturally, we have the correlates of the old lady in my street in the youth that does the Erasmus project, the student interchange project in Europe. They call themselves the sons and daughters of the Erasmus program, where they go to other countries, marry with people of other countries. There's apparently more than 1 million babies that are called the Erasmus babies. And, where that throws back to is to Erasmus's of Rotterdam, Erasmus of Rotterdam's time, which was the 16th century, where they were starting to think about redistribution and migration. There's actually a dialogue in one of Erasmus's books where two beggars are talking about begging in the Netherlands, and one says, now they do not allow me to go from Rotterdam to Leiden because they have subsidies for the poor in Leiden, and they have discovered that if they give subsidies to the poor in Leiden, everybody is going to go from the rest of the Netherlands to Leiden. So they were already thinking that if you have freedom of circulation, as you have in the EU, you need to have redistribution at the same scale. So maybe we need to go back to these times, think about what is the revolutionary technological change in communication that is, just around the corner that we could use, since YouTube and Twitter and Facebook are already, owned by large corporations that are in thrall of the far right or are being used by the far right. I was talking to Rebecca about this, a crazy idea. Maybe virtual reality, augmented reality, immersive reality, that could be interesting. We could try to use those tools to do what we did with the Ulysses documentary. If you look for Ulysses Breaking the Spell of the Crisis, you'll see a documentary where James participates about overcoming the European crisis. And say that what we need, the New Deal that we use, it's a new deal between humanity, nature, and technology. That makes sense to a different constituency of people than what the Make America Great Again argument makes sense. But that we need a new deal between humanity, nature, and technology is, I think, a winning argument. It can make sense to an increasingly larger constituency, to whom then we can say, we just need to tax what is owed. The EU loses, maybe tomorrow's panel is going to address this, already 1 trillion euros every year in tax evasion. For you to have an idea, 1 trillion euros, it's the budget of the whole EU for 10 years, not for 1 year or 2 or 3. The budget of the EU is around 100 billion every year. It's really, really small, a small budget. But if you tax what is owed in tax evasion every year in the EU, you have the money for the Green New Deal, even without entering in the minutiae of macroeconomic doctrines. The money is there. If you say it's to create a new deal, it's to save the planet, to create a new deal between humanity, nature, and technology, people will say, go for that money. It's there. We should use it.
And with that call for revolutionary action, I'd like to ask you to thank the panelists, and we're now moving to our first keynote speaker in the lunch area over there. But thank you very much indeed.